LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Bernardo Kastrup, who joins us to discuss his book, Why Materialism Is Baloney, How True Skeptics Know There Is No Death, and Fathom the Answers to Life, the Universe, and Everything. The present framing of the cultural debate in terms of materialism versus religion has allowed materialism to go unchallenged as the only rationally viable metaphysics. Why Materialism Is Baloney seeks to change this. It uncovers the absurd implications of materialism and then presents a hard-nosed, non-materialist metaphysics substantiated by skepticism, empirical evidence, and clear logical reasoning. It lays out a coherent framework upon which one can interpret and make sense of every natural phenomenon and physical law, as well as the modalities of human consciousness, without materialist assumptions. According to this framework, the brain is merely the image of a self-localization process of mind, similar to how a whirlpool is the image of a self-localization process of water. The brain doesn't generate mind in the same way that a whirlpool doesn't generate water. It is the brain that is in mind, not mind in the brain, and therefore physical death is merely a dispersion of awareness. The implications of this wider reality for our notions of human life, purpose, and meaning are simply immense. Hello and welcome, Bernardo, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thanks for having me, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, today, Bernardo, we're going to talk about your book, Why Materialism Is Baloney, How True Skeptics Know There Is No Death, and Fathom Answers to Life, the Universe, and Everything. So, pretty big statement right there in the title. Before we jump into all that, just tell listeners a little bit about your background and your work in general. You've written several books with particular themes. Just tell us how you came to be interested in these areas, because it involved you from sort of, as I see it, from a scientific background, beginning to evolve a whole new paradigm, a whole new worldview.
That's true. It was quite a jump for me. I mean, I come from science, academia, and the technology industry. I have a degree in computer engineering. I used to work at CERN in Switzerland, the main temple of physics worldwide. I've worked in other research laboratories. And then at some point, I don't know, in my midlife, around 35, for reasons that that escape me, I can't really make sense of that, I started asking myself questions that I never asked before, and looking with more critical eyes to the materialist worldview that I had always subscribed to sort of by default without thinking too much about it. And that sort of cracked Pandora's box open, and you start pulling that thread, and before you see, your whole worldview has changed purely on the basis of fact, empirical fact, logic, and critical thinking.
Okay, well, as a way of just getting everyone up to speed in what our discussion is going to certainly start out with, perhaps you could say something about where we are, where the science of the 20th century and now the early 21st has taken us, where it has left us in terms of materialism versus all the other metaphysical considerations that we take into account when we're trying to figure out, life, the universe, and everything.
Well, I think the greatest ill of our age, certainly when it comes to science, is that science today in practice is conflating science itself with a particular metaphysics, a particular interpretation of science, which is materialism. Materialism is a metaphysics. It postulates that there is an entire world fundamentally outside consciousness, even though you can't have direct access to that world, because we are all locked into consciousness. Knowledge only exists in consciousness. If you look at the ideal formulation of science as a method to investigate nature, it's a method that suits itself to researching and modeling the patterns and regularities of nature without passing judgment on the fundamental nature of the entities behind those patterns and regularities, which is something science as a method can't do. It's an issue of philosophy, an issue of metaphysics, of ontology. But scientists, the people who actually practice science today, largely conflate these two, and that leads to an artificial limitation of science, because it puts boundaries on what is allowed to be possible based on philosophical, theoretical considerations, and not based on an open-minded investigation of nature. That is a problem. And we've come to this because science has been so spectacularly successful in developing technology, serious technologies like things that help us live longer and healthier, but also toys, toy technologies, and all kinds of things that make a big impact on culture. And we sort of misinterpret the ability of science as a method to develop technology. We misinterpret that as proof of a fundamental understanding of the underlying nature of reality. That's, of course, false. I mean, you can be a 5-year-old kid and play a computer game and be a world champion in that computer game without having any understanding of the underlying architecture of the computer or software that runs the game. Science studies the patterns and regularities of reality as they manifest to our 5 senses. It cannot pass judgment on the underlying nature of those patterns and regularities. That's an issue of philosophy.
Yeah, and just to be clear, nobody's saying that a lot of these scientific models don't bear out, as you say, what our 5 senses pick up. But science is one way of gleaning information about our world, about our reality. And it's actually surprisingly limited. But as you say, it's become so ingrained in modern thinking, we should emphasize, relatively recent, that people see it as the only way. It should be one of, a toolbox of methodologies for looking at the nature of reality. And I've got lots of friends actually who consider themselves to be open-minded and skeptical in the good sense of the word, but they actually get quite militant about it if you try and talk about anything other than raw scientific data. And in fact, I've looked at this most of my life as well, and what science can tell us, as you say, a great deal. It's contributed so much to some, certain types of progress, whether you consider extremely advanced weapons progress or not. It's given, humanity a lot to think about, and as you say, a lot to play with. But, I used to be constantly surprised, and not anymore when I look into when science is trying to explain certain, fundamental things, for example, like the nature of consciousness. It actually can tell us very, very little. And there's some people, perhaps even some scientists, who think that Victorian idea still somehow holds out, that we more or less understand everything. We're just trying to fill in a few gaps. That couldn't be further from the truth.
That is incredibly naive indeed. And we can say that without denying the fact that the models that science comes up with are by and large, or maybe the vast majority, correct. But where it goes wrong is to think that because we have those correct models, we understand the underlying nature of things. Science as a method applies to the shared aspects of reality, the consensus part of reality that we all share as an outside experience. It has nothing to say about the introspective aspects of reality, what we experience when we look within, our own subjectivity, our own inner life. It has very little to say about that. Some would claim that that's not true, that neuroscience and psychology have made progress in understanding certain aspects of subjective experience. I would disagree with that. It's to a small extent true, but certainly not true for in the aspects that really matter, like what consciousness itself is, as you said. Science has very little to say about that. It's called the explanatory gap, or the hard problem of consciousness. We just have no idea, not even in principle, how we can deduce the qualities of subjective experience, the redness of red, the bitterness of regret, from the properties of matter, like charge, mass, momentum, and spin. We just do not know how to bridge that gap. And unfortunately, subjective experience is all reality as far as we can ever know.
Yes, I remember when I was a child, when we're kids, we tend to look at the world, experience it with a sense of wonder, and it's a magical place to us. And there's a lot of things that we just integrate that we start to sort of become separate from as we get older, particularly as teenagers. But later, of course, the influence of our culture comes to bear there. But I remember being told if I had a bad dream, that the dream wasn't real by my parents. I think it's understandable. I think most parents do that. But I was kind of like, well, when I dreamt that I was being eaten by a tiger, it felt pretty damn real. I woke up in distress. And in what sense was it not real? I experienced it. And that's an important aspect in your book, to thinking about subjective experience and about our inner world. And of course, we're discouraged in this day and age, particularly from trusting our own senses, and not even our own five senses, but also our intuitive sense, a gut reaction. That's all devalued as unscientific. And we're being asked instead to trust, the hardcore materialists out there, and we all know who some of the high profile ones are, but yet they are individuals who deny their own subjective experience, or just say that it doesn't exist. I mean, someone like Richard Dawkins, for example, is there anyone in the world apart from himself that he really loves? And in that instance, what does science have to tell us about love? I suppose they would boil it down to sweaty palms and pheromones and all the rest of it, and all the biological reactions, but that's not what love is. If you look at a sunset and you're mesmerized by its beauty, well, what explains that? How can you scientifically explain that? Again, science would give us perhaps some biological reactions to that, but that's not the same thing.
Yeah, we are lost in a forest of projections. We think that we get closer to the truth by projecting the only reality we have access to, which is the reality of immediate, direct, subjective experience, by projecting that reality onto some kind of abstract world outside consciousness for which there is no proof. It's only an inference. And we somehow get a fuzzy, comfortable feeling in the act of projecting that reality onto the outside, giving it names, as if by giving them names, the mystery would disappear just because we call it something and everybody knows that name. And we feel comfortable and cozy when we do that. That's merely psychological projection. I mean, the only reality we will ever know is the reality of immediate experience. A valid question is to say, what among my experiences, which ones are shared, are actual part of consensus reality? Like if you go to the beach with a friend and you're both watching the waves, those waves are a shared component of reality, and it is true in the sense that it is shared. But you have other experiences that are personal, idiosyncratic, unique, like your nightly dreams, some visions or illusions even you might have. Those are real as experiences. Even an illusory experience that doesn't correspond to a consensus fact is real as an experience. It is real as such. And it's no less real than a shared experience as far as the subjective impact it has on us. So there is a naive sense in science, in materialism, and in mainstream culture at large to define truth as an experience that corresponds to a supposed abstract fact outside consciousness. That's mere projection. It's much more productive to classify experiences instead of between true and false experiences, to classify them as collective shared experiences on the one hand and idiosyncratic private experiences on the other hand. That's much closer to the truth of immediate experience and much more useful.
I'll come back to consensus reality and the nature of what is true or what is real a little bit later, but we're talking about, in essence, about the cold, hard way that we're supposed to, science tells us, look at the world, ourselves, and our interactions with the outside world. In the book, you take apart materialism in the sense that whilst acknowledging its usefulness and where it actually is correct, there are some necessary kind of inferences that follow from the basic tenets that will probably surprise some people. Like you'll say, materialism says this, which therefore implies the following, and the following is kind of like, wow, that's really counterintuitive. So perhaps, I mean, you've given a load of examples in the books, perhaps one or two for people who may be thinking of their own worldview as hard, cold, materialistic. Makes a lot of sense. It's intuitive, but actually maybe they haven't done the thought exercise to follow through as to what leads on from that.
Yeah, materialism is not intuitive at all. It is the ultimate in counterintuitiveness. What happens is that in the culture at large, we mistake the intuitiveness of other metaphysics, other worldviews, and we attribute that mistakenly to materialism. Let me give you an example, as you asked. According to materialism, the only reality is a reality of quantities and concepts, a reality that has none of the qualities of experience. So the world outside has no color, no flavor, no melody, no texture, no warmth, because all these things are qualities of experience. And experience is generated by your brain inside your skull. So everything you experience is supposedly, according to materialism, within your head. Your real skull is beyond the room where you're sitting. If you're looking at the stars, your real skull is beyond the stars, because the stars you see are created within your head. Their color, their brightness, everything you feel, all the qualities of the experience of seeing stars are supposedly created by your brain inside your head. And the outside world is, you can't even visualize. It's pure abstraction, pure quantity, pure conceptualization. On the other hand, an alternative metaphysics that would say all reality is in consciousness. There is no material world outside consciousness. If you say that, people quickly point out to you, it's not true. Reality is outside my head. Of course, if we say that all reality is in consciousness, then it is your body, your head, your brain, as parts of reality that are in consciousness, not consciousness in your head. Consciousness in your head is an implication of materialism, not of the metaphysics that there is only consciousness. If I say that there is only consciousness, then the reality of the computer in front of me, with its color, with its smell, it really exists outside my head, because my head is also in consciousness, the computer is in consciousness, and it's outside my head. So to say that reality is entirely in consciousness is actually much more intuitive, because it grants reality to be exactly what it seems to be. It grants that the qualities of experience are really out there outside our heads, that an apple is really red, that an orange really smells like it does, that a rough wall really has the texture it has, and that those things are not merely reproductions created inside my head by my brain.
One of the most interesting, thought-provoking points in the book for me that came up was in talking about materialism, that you got onto exactly this idea of a hallucinated reality, because the whole idea that our five senses see, quote unquote, only a fraction of reality. If we had expanded awareness, you say, for example, like some animals like cats and dogs appear to have a slightly expanded awareness in certain frequency zones. This is all being kind of like filtered and controlled. And this idea that we're living in a matrix, or Aldous Huxley's idea of the doors of perception, that's something that you hear being spoken about by certain people who are very much not materialistic, or see themselves as not materialistic. So it's interesting that those two get joined together in a certain line of thinking.
Well, to be honest with you, I don't like the analogy of the matrix, and I'll tell you why. The matrix requires an incredibly complex computer to generate the simulation. And to say that reality is like the matrix would suggest that you need this invisible computer that is generating reality. And that isn't parsimonious. That would defeat one of the key values behind philosophy and behind science as well, which is to not postulate more entities than you need. I think what's happening is that everything can be explained as excitations of consciousness itself. We don't need to postulate a world outside consciousness that gets excited and in turn excites consciousness. That step only postpones the problem and solves nothing. We can say that we can explain everything by imagining that consciousness itself, whatever it is, consciousness itself gets excited and produces the patterns and regularities of nature and of our inner lives as well. And in a sense, I can understand the link with the matrix, because reality then wouldn't correspond to something outside consciousness. It would be a kind of simulation, I understand that, but it's a simulation that does not require the simulator. It doesn't require the computer that generates the simulator. In exactly the same way that the complexity of the universe under materialism can be explained by the simple laws of physics, under my philosophical position, which is called idealism, we can explain the complexities of experience based on certain simple principles of the nature of consciousness. No big complex computer to generate this whole thing.
In some of the reading I've done around popular science, coming from a materialist perspective, I've been struck by how, in attempting to explain more and more, running up against more problems, a lot of them related to consciousness, that materialistic science has become very Byzantine and very Baroque, and it's invoking more and more things that can't possibly be tested in order to fill in gaps. And that itself isn't terribly scientific. Now, I know part of science seems to be, suggesting the theoretical existence of something in order to make progress. But I mean, you correct me here if you think this is a wrong way to look at it. It seems that a lot of gaps have been filled in with a lot of theoretical things, and that's kind of been moved along the conveyor belt, and they're now somewhere else down there postulating more non-existent things that can't possibly be tested in order to, fill in the gaps here so that the whole edifice will stand up to scrutiny.
Yeah, it's not even to make progress in terms of practical applications. The biggest example of what you're saying is the idea of multiple parallel universes in science, which is one of the ways to philosophically solve the measurement problem in quantum physics.
Yes.
That's only a question of interpretation. We have the mathematical arsenal. It works. We can calculate things and create practical applications like quantum computers, regardless of what interpretation applies. The interpretation is a matter of philosophy. The problem is that many scientists have become philosophers. They hold on to certain values and they reject others that they feel they need to fight against. For the past couple of 100 years, one of the key values that many scientists viscerally fight against is the idea of meaning and purpose. They cannot accept the possibility that there may be meaning and purpose to nature and reality. But if the universe is so fine-tuned to enable the evolution of intelligent life, if the measurement problem in quantum mechanics seems to escape all deterministic attempts to explain it, then that suggests that there may actually be some meaning and purpose behind nature, but that cannot be accepted. So what do we have to postulate, to infer without any proof in order to get away from this idea of meaning and purpose? We have to postulate that there are countless other parallel universes that we have fundamentally no access to and cannot prove, where everything else that could possibly happen actually does happen. So there is no conscious choice, no meaning, no purpose to the evolution of life as we witness in this universe. It is just one of an infinitude of others, where all the other meaningless possibilities also happen. That preserves a kind of mechanistic, blind determinism, eliminates meaning and purpose. But the cost of doing this is to postulate the most unparsimonious, inflationary set of entities conceivable, which is that in some other parallel universe, everything that can happen actually does happen. This is worse than religion. This is purely based on value judgments. It totally ignores evidence. It flies away, it flies in the face of parsimony. And I think it is a tragedy that the new priesthood of science that unfortunately gets a lot of airtime on the BBC, Nova, and PBS and all this media, mainstream media channels, have been promoting this kind of religious idea based merely on a philosophical bias.
It reminds me of the story of the little parable, fable, whatever you want to call it. I can't remember where this comes from, but the world turtle. The world is resting on the back of a giant turtle, and what's underneath the turtle? And somebody says, well, it's turtles all the way.
You need a lot of turtles to make sense of that, yeah.
But, of course, talk of meaning and purpose in a lot of people's minds, if they're coming from a materialistic perspective, not if they're scientists, if they're just an average guy in the street who's maybe thought, in his armchair of an evening a bit about why we're here and all the rest of it, they've got religious connotations. As soon as you start talking about meaning and purpose, it's kind of like, well, then you're letting in these ideas about God and about there's a reason we're here. But it doesn't have to be like that. That's just another way of viewing it. I mean, it's not, the ideas of meaning and purpose wouldn't detract from hard science. In fact, it might find ways to advance hard science, ultimately, give it a grounding, a bedding that would help make sense of it. But of course, we live in, I think this is gradually changing, but in times when there's a very stark divide between materialistic science and any alternative ways, the sort of thing that you're writing about, different ways of viewing it, where you're not trying to junk science at all, you're just trying to put it in some kind of bigger perspective, really.
Absolutely. Science in its ideal form passes no judgment about what nature is allowed or not allowed to be. Nature is simply what is, and science is a method to investigate the patterns and regularities of nature as they are. The problem is that for a while now, for a couple of hundred years, we have this metaphor of reality as a kind of mechanism, as a kind of machine, and has been updated recently to a kind of computer, and all reality being information being processed in that computer, which is also mechanistic, as any computer is. And because of this metaphor, we exclude meaning and purpose, because meaning and purpose doesn't fit into the mechanism metaphor. Mechanisms simply unfold, they simply work, they don't have meaning and purpose. But it's not writ large anywhere. God did not descend from the sky and decreed that there is no meaning and purpose in reality. These are, meaning and purpose are two concepts that have clear definitions, and for all we know, they may actually exist out there. We are not in a position to judge either way right now. On the basis of empirical evidence, it seems actually like there is meaning and purpose. Too many things out there in physics and in other areas of science are suggestive that there is. But it's just a mismatch with this metaphor that many people are married to at a deep psychological level that doesn't allow them to entertain that possibility and to push meaning and purpose away and stick to mechanistic determinism at the cost of unfathomable inflationary philosophies.
I don't think at any stage in my life felt that matter was all that mattered. I think it's probably something I managed to carry over from childhood, holding on to that sort of sense of wonder, which is very valuable. But at some point it occurred to me, I would certainly have called myself an atheist when I was a teenager, but at some point I came to realize, it was something my grandfather said actually, you don't believe anything, you either know it or you don't know it. And I thought, okay, in that case I know nothing. And it was at that point, which actually can be quite empowering, because then you don't get so bogged down in what you don't know and what you don't know and worrying about all of that. But then atheism became untenable. I say to people, oh, I'm an atheist. I say, is that because you believe there is no God? Or is it because you know, for example, and we can use whatever symbol or metaphor you want for God just for the sake of it. But it occurs to me that two things really in science versus religion in this context. Scientists, of course, whether they care to dwell on it or admit it or whatever, they've got emotions and they've got egos, and that comes into play in their thinking and in their work, whether they like it or not. And also, it surprises me, or maybe it doesn't actually, thinking about it, how many religious, and I put that in air quotes, religious people today, people who claim to be religious, are actually content to be materialistic. If you actually probe what they think about, that's their actual perspective. They might say, oh yes, I believe in God and an afterlife, but that's not how they live. That's not how they behave. And actually, in terms of where we are now in the world, I think that sort of superficial religion and a hardcore materialism, they actually reinforce each other in a way and cause a lot of problems.
Totally. They totally reinforce each other. We live in such a soup, such a confusion of concepts and language. We say things and disagree with each other without actually knowing what we are saying, what the other is saying. Case in point, you just mentioned atheism. What is atheism? I don't know what it is. It seems to be the denial of an entity that we call God. But God is the most overloaded word in the history of language. There are probably 7 billion different definitions for God in the world today. So it is atheism. But what is that theism? That theism is undefined. So the atheism is also undefined. You can say that I am atheism with respect to the God of Catholicism, or even with respect to the God of the Old Testament as opposed to the God of the New Testament, or I am atheistic with respect to the gods of Hinduism, but you cannot just say I'm atheist because you're saying nothing. I don't know what you're denying when we say that. Are you denying some kind of consciousness that goes beyond the personal. If that's what you're denying, fine, but it doesn't touch on the points usually associated with religion. So I think we are all very, very confused, and we are confused because of our poor use of language.
Now, there are quite a few scientists and science writers and other researchers operating at the moment who, for some time, who've been developing this idea. And again, this ties in neatly with some of the concepts in your book, that there seems to be some ideas that are emerging collectively, a bit like the telephone being invented at the same time by two different people. And this idea of consciousness actually being fundamental, saying, okay, let's maybe take that as a starting point, as a concept, and see where we get with that. And this idea has come up again and again. I've certainly been reading about it for several decades now. And you've written about this, and you talk about the filter hypothesis. And this is another idea that has some echoes in things that have been written before, in terms of, I mentioned earlier, about that we see a fraction of reality, etc., etc. But you take a different slant on this, one I haven't quite read before. So perhaps say a little bit about the fundamental nature of consciousness, and then your take on the filter hypothesis, and why that might be so, what purpose it might serve.
Yeah, I don't think that this idea of consciousness as fundamental is a new concept. Actually, I think it is the antithesis of conceptualization. We've gotten lost in a forest of concepts and abstractions over the decades, actually. And I think what I and a few other people are trying to do is, let's step back. Let's step back from that confusion, from that labyrinth of abstractions and concepts that we created ourselves and started believing it's real. Let's step back to the basics. Where do we start from before we, quote, know anything? We know that we are conscious, that we have subjective experience. If we can explain reality on the basis of that alone, without postulating other entities, like a whole world outside consciousness, which is equivalent to the flying spaghetti monster, if we can do that, then that is sufficient. Let's stop there. Let's stop making all these unprovable inferences and postulates. Now, in order for that to work, in order for you to make sense of reality as a phenomenon of and in consciousness alone, you have to explain a number of things. And the idea of the filter hypothesis is part of that explanation. I think reality is the unfolding of an impersonal stream of experiences that you could visualize like a little water stream. And we are localizations of the flow of experiences in the stream, like whirlpools, if you will. And it's that localization that creates the sense of personal identity and separateness. We live life from the point of view of the center of the whirlpool, the center of that little vortex of experiences, and the whole world going around us from our perspective. But there is nothing to a whirlpool but the stream itself. So there's nothing to us but consciousness itself. And the brain and the body-brain system is just the image of that process of localization. Like the whirlpool is the image of a process of water flow localization. The brain doesn't generate consciousness for exactly the same reason that a whirlpool doesn't generate water. Exact same reason. And yet, the image of the process correlates with the process, that being the reason why brain activity correlates so well with first-person subjective experience. One is the outside image of the other. Of course, they will be correlated. It doesn't mean that the brain generates your subjective experiences. It's just the way experiences look like from the outside. Now, if you take all that on board, and I know I'm giving a lot of information in a short amount of time, but if you take all that on board, you realize that a whirlpool works as a sort of filter in the stream of water. It captures certain water molecules and keeps it circulating locally, but it also, on the edges, pushes away other water molecules. And I think that's exactly what's happening with us. The image of the whirlpool we are, our brain, works as a filter. It maintains some experiences within the loop, our immediate experience of reality, and it filters out other things, things that are not available to our lucid awareness at given points in time, the rest of what's going on in the universe. And the image of that filtering is a healthy, active brain. Evidence for what I'm saying would be that if you would engage in an activity that reduced brain activity, would your awareness then expand not necessarily become sharper, not necessarily become more lucid, but expand in the sense of allowing you to be aware of things in space-time locales that you shouldn't be able to be aware of through your five senses. It turns out that that's exactly what happens. Psychedelics have been shown, at least psilocybin, has been shown to reduce brain activity and lead to an unfathomable expansion of awareness. Activities that reduce blood flow to the brain, like gravity-induced loss of consciousness, even strangulation, hyperventilation, which constricts blood vessels in the brain, they all lead to expanded awareness of things, events, and information that you shouldn't be aware of under ordinary conditions. And so basically, I think that's what's going on. And if that is indeed what's going on, then the image of the dissolution of the whirlpool, the end of the filter, the end of that localization, is physical death, which then should correlate to the ultimate expansion of awareness, not the end of consciousness.
Yes, there's an important distinction in this context that you make in the book between unconscious and conscious, in the sense that there's this idea that, as you say, this wider reality, which is, and the stream beyond that whirlpool that is kind of lost to us. But it's not really that. You're saying in a way, we are in fact conscious of all this information in the rest of, the solar system, the galaxy, the universe, wider reality. But there's a intensification, I think you used the word amplification, of our experience within our own little narrow band of experience while we're in this body, in this reality. And that actually is so kind of loud, as it were, it excludes other things. And that hence the idea that reduced brain activity can allow more access to that information, not the idea in materialist science where if you were having a psychedelic experience, there would be massively heightened brain activity and that's where the experience is coming from. It's not like that at all. And also, you saying that we are conscious of all in a way, but it's just kind of obscured temporarily. It's not just semantics to say that it's not unconscious, because there's a big difference between it being us being at one level and all that being below or outside, and actually us being conscious of everything, but just having this heightened awareness of a very narrow band of experience.
Yeah, let's take an example. Your listeners have been paying attention to our conversation for the past several minutes. Have they been unconscious of their breathing? Have they really been unconscious of the feeling of the air going in and out of the nostrils, the inflation of the lungs, the movement of the diaphragm and the muscles in the chest? Have they really been unconscious of that until this moment, until I said that? Because now they are conscious of it because their attention is on it. But before I said it, were they really unconscious? Or was the breathing merely an obfuscated content of consciousness? A content that was in consciousness, but was not within the field of attention, that field of amplification that reinforces certain mental contents, like our conversation right now, and obfuscates everything else, like the breathing. I think what has happened is that we made a mistake of categories. There is no unconscious. If reality is in consciousness, then everything is in consciousness. There can be no unconscious as something that is fundamentally different from consciousness. We invented this concept of an unconscious because we mistook different degrees on a scale of consciousness for a fundamental ontological difference. There isn't that fundamental ontological difference. What seems unconscious is just the contents of consciousness that are so small, so obfuscated with respect to the amplified contents of egoic awareness, what you place your attention on, that they seem unconscious, but they aren't really unconscious because all reality is in consciousness.
Let's say something about realism versus idealism, because that's two things that for most people may have meanings to them that are actually not at all what they think. Realism, kind of obvious, that sounds like it's rational, intuitive. Idealism sounds like something from Greek philosophy. But when you actually look at how they form up as worldviews that include science and also other understandings and intuitions beyond that, then realism actually becomes something that can actually be quite unreal.
Yeah, we start from empirical evidence. Experiments with quantum entanglement today, particularly a group in Austria by a group led by Professor Anton Zeilinger, have been showing that realism is becoming nearly untenable. Realism is this notion that there is a reality outside of consciousness in which we can then consciously observe, but that reality would still go merrily on even if there were no consciousness in the universe at all. That is realism. It has this specific definition. And experiments in quantum physics have been making that notion progressively more untenable. It's not completely out of question yet, but it's pretty precarious. You have to do quite some mathematical acrobatics to maintain an avenue for that interpretation of reality. And if you step back and think about it, you realize that it's a conclusion from long ago that was not really carefully thought through. The motivation for realism comes from two things. One, reality outside of our heads seems to unfold totally independent of our volition, of our will. Two, we seem to share that same reality with multiple people, right? We go to the beach together, we all see the same waves. So if reality were a dream, were purely in consciousness, which is what idealism states, then how come we are all sharing the same dream? How come things happen that we have no volitional control over? And this conclusion, although it sounds reasonable, upon more careful inspection, it falls apart completely. You see, let's take the first point. Reality doesn't unfold according to our wishes, to our volition. Well, that doesn't deny that reality is still in consciousness. When you dream at night, the dream is unquestionably in your consciousness. It doesn't exist outside of your head. Yet it unfolds in ways that are not according to your volition. Your character in the dream can have a nightmare, and he certainly doesn't want it to be a nightmare. Or a schizophrenic that has visions, hallucinations. Those are things that are unquestionably only in consciousness. They do not exist outside consciousness, but they are not under the control of volition. So it is a mistake to construe contents of consciousness that are not under the control of egoic volition for contents of consciousness that supposedly are outside consciousness. That's a mistake. There is no implication error in that link. The other one, which is, since we are separate people, how come we can be having the same dream? It begs the question. It's based on circular reasoning. It assumes materialism to begin with. It assumes realism to begin with, because it's only by assuming that our minds are constrained by our bodies, that mind is within the brain, it's only by assuming that to begin with that you can say that since our bodies are separate, we can't be having the same dream because our minds are then separate. Well, wait a moment. If all reality is in consciousness, then it is our bodies that are in consciousness, not consciousness in our bodies. Therefore, the fact that bodies are separate in the fabric of space-time does not imply that the psyches of different people are at bottom, at the most obfuscated levels, actually unified. Depth psychology has called that the collective unconscious. I don't like the word unconscious. I think it's a misnomer. I would rather call it the collective obfuscated consciousness. But nonetheless, they have found a lot of empirical evidence that it does exist. So if it does, then what we call consensus reality is simply a collective dream generated by this collective segment of consciousness, which is otherwise obfuscated by egoic amplification.
For a lot of people who give it some superficial thought, that they see other human beings, other animals dying, they see empires rising and falling, they see forests growing up and being destroyed, and the world goes on. And it's very tempting to think, because, you know, again, we talked earlier about this narrow focus of our little whirlpool of reality, very tempting just to assume that our focus is all there for the most part. And it'd be easy just to say, well, of course there's a reality outside there that is going to be there whether we're here or not, whether consciousness is here or not. It appears to be the case in a 70-year lifespan.
There is certainly a reality outside our personal consciousness, our personal psyches. Idealism does not deny that. Idealism is not saying that there is only what I personally can observe or what other people personally can observe. What idealism says, at least my formulation of idealism, is that we are whirlpools in the stream of mind. But there are things going on in that stream, which is pure consciousness, which are outside the whirlpools as well. So to say that all reality is in consciousness does not imply that there isn't a reality outside of our personal psyches. There clearly is. And it is generated, imagined, if you will, by this collective level of consciousness, which is obfuscated by our personal egoic awareness.
Yeah, I think that's the main point to draw out of what we're saying here, is that truth or reality is more dependent on whether the experience is individual or collective. For example, one person sees a flying saucer over LA. Well, obviously they're crazy. 100 people see it. To them, it becomes real. It certainly lends it more credence. The people watching the news in the evening may go, "Oh, they're all bonkers. How could they possibly all see that?" But if you take that, expand that out into a wider perspective, that does seem to be the case. And we certainly have instances all the time of people seeing things that other people don't see, and there's even a suggestibility in those terms. If you take, for example, under influence of psychedelic substances, people can be suggestible. Sort of like one person could say, "Oh, look at that blue monkey sitting on top of the television," because that's what they're seeing, and the other person's like, "Don't get. Oh, hang on a minute, now I see it." If you see what I mean, and that still works on some level in our sober, wide awake, middle of the afternoon, everyday reality.
Yeah, I think, look, if everybody witnesses it, it is real for all intents and purposes. If reality is in consciousness and you don't have a world outside consciousness to compare your conscious perceptions to and determine whether it's real or not, then the only criterion for considering something real is the degree of sharing, the degree to which an experience is consensual. That said, I think we have to be very careful, because this idea can be misused for not so nice purposes. Idealism, and what I just said, does not mean that there is no difference between fantasy and fact. Of course, there is a huge difference between a personal fantasy and a fact. A fact is consensually shared. A fantasy is personal and idiosyncratic. So the risk that we have is that somebody who is basically crazy and delusional or whatever, or has dubious intent, will hijack this idea to say, I create my own reality, so my delusion is real, and therefore I will impose the implications of my delusion on other people. That's where it can go very wrong. So just to insist, this formulation of idealism I'm putting forward does not imply that there is no difference between fact and fiction, fact and fantasy. There clearly is an enormous importance, fundamental difference between fact and fiction. It is just not the kind of difference that realists/materialists would like it to be. It's a more mature, more subtle difference.
Extending on from the thought on consensus reality, collective experience, there was a segment in the book which I really liked, a paragraph which I'm just going to read, and that resonated with me in terms of people's day-to-day experience of their lives, of reality. And it is this: if you pay careful attention, you will notice that each one of us seems to live in a largely private reality. Some in a reality of bright hues, round forms, excitement and mystery, others in a grey and bland reality of indifference, hopelessness and quiet existential despair. Yet others in a world of sharp angles, straight lines, strong contrasts, loud noises, order and hierarchy, etc. Our realities are determined by our unique states of mind. That's totally been my experience of life, in terms of I know people who live in grey, depressing, despondent worlds, and I know other people who live in quite the opposite. So it's a lot to do with our perceptions and our interpretation, and this is where my earlier thoughts on meaning and even purpose come in, that how we interpret all of this can affect our state of mind and can literally affect, some people might say, oh, well, yeah, if you're despondent about the world, then you can snap out of that, or if you're very optimistic, that can change in a flash if something happens. That's true, but this actually is affecting reality in ways that a person living in despondency and despair is in some ways living in a different world to someone who's very upbeat and very optimistic and enjoying life.
Absolutely. Just to highlight the consistency between what I'm about to say and what I just said before, I do think that there are facts of reality. Facts because they are shared experiences that anybody would acknowledge and agree to. And that's in contrast to total delusional fantasy, which is a private experience. So I think that difference exists. But the facts, the shared facts of reality, are much smaller in determining our inner lives, our experience of the world. They are much less significant than most people would believe them to be. They are basically a very thin skeleton of our lives. Everything else around that skeleton, the muscle, the fat tissue, the skin, the colors, the nuances, we feel ourselves within our own personal psyches, within the whirlpool, if you will. And in that sense, we each may live in a fairly different world than every other person. For instance, there is an experiment in philosophy that illustrates this very well. We all agree what we mean when we say the word green. But we do not know how each one of us actually experiences that color. All we know is that whatever those experiences are, we agree on the word as it applies to the experience. To give you an example, suppose that there was a human being that always saw blue when everybody else sees green, and always saw green when everybody else saw blue. Would you be able to tell it? You wouldn't. This person would learn the meaning of the words blue and green according to his own internal experience. And nobody, not even that person, would have a clue that he's actually seeing those colors in an inverted manner. We would be none the wiser, because the consensus fact of reality has only to do with the consistency with which we apply the word to certain objects. Only the consistency, not the absolute value of that quality as it relates to the object. So we would be none the wiser. That person would be living, for all intents and purposes, in a color world very different from our own, and we would still agree on all the facts and all the language.
Yeah, you stress several times in the book, actually, the limitations of language. And this is something I've come across again and again in researching these sort of topics. We're not aware sometimes how limiting it is, that we have words for certain things that they can not only mean slightly different things or maybe very different things to other people, but we are not really equipped to go into some of the areas that you do in terms of language. It's just not quite adequate. And I think this is why you use so many metaphors in your book and stress the importance of them, but also remind readers again and again, these are metaphors. For example, the whirlpool metaphor, which is central. You're not suggesting that there's anything that actually looks like a whirlpool happening anywhere, in consciousness that's directly relating to what you're saying.
Yeah, there's nothing looks like a whirlpool. The whirlpool looks like a brain inside a skull surrounded by a biological body. That's what the whirlpool looks like. The whirlpool is just a way of seeing. It's an attempt to convey a way of seeing what a brain is, what a body is, not an attempt to replace the actual images of reality, a brain and a body, with the image of a whirlpool. That would be taking the metaphor way too far. But I do think that language is central to almost every single problem we face as a culture and as a society and as individual people in the world today. It's mostly a problem of communication at all levels. Language has evolved to pick out those small aspects of experience that are shared. Language evolved to pick out the facts. Like suppose there were no language and our primitive ancestors, one of them would then point to a tree and say the word tree. Of course, it was not English, but bear with me. And say the word tree by pointing at it. And another one would look at the tree and repeat the word tree, because the tree is a shared aspect of experience. So they could agree on what the word tree means by pointing to that shared experience. The problem is that, as we just discussed, the shared aspects of reality are relatively restricted. They play a relatively small role in how our inner lives unfold. So as a consequence, language only applies to a very small part of our inner lives, because that's how it evolved. That's what it evolved to do, to identify those shared aspects. And we are at a loss to convey to anybody else most of the richness of reality as we experience it, which is the reality of our inner lives. And that leads to all kinds of confusions because we are not aware of that limitation. We think that everything that is of any importance can be said, can be made sense of in words. And that is a hugely mistaken assumption. The fact that we make this assumption leads to all kinds of problems, including, and I would say that without any shame, because you brought up the subject yourself, including militant atheism. They don't know what you're talking about. And by the way, neither do the religious guys many times. We are talking here about inner aspects of experience that are ineffable, that escape language. So it doesn't make any sense to agree or disagree with it because nobody knows what they are talking about. They only know how they themselves experience it. So the best we can say is that militant atheists are people who are psychologically dissociated from certain aspects of their psyches. They are disconnected from the deeper, more obfuscated levels of consciousness from which certain experiences arise that others would, with difficulty and limitations, describe in religious terms. Atheists are basically, from that perspective, people who are slightly more blind than others and are not aware of it.
I just take a little detour here, a slight cul-de-sac, in that we're not going to pursue this extensively, but you do touch upon it in the book, and I think it's worth mentioning, even at the risk of raising some people's eyebrows, because it's very simple, really. It doesn't have to be controversial at all. If we go back to our stream of mind and whirlpool metaphor, and we are as individual, ego-enabled beings centered on that very concentrated awareness that excludes so much else, virtually everything else going on within mind. If that awareness gets to pick up a little bit more information from the periphery of the whirlpool, stuff that is actually floating beyond our normal awareness, this can help us to perhaps rethink certain non-material phenomena that have been mysteries, absolute mysteries, within the materialist paradigm. And I'm thinking of everything here from aliens to ghosts, angels, devils, the idea of other dimensions, past lives, precognition, all these things that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence for, and there's certainly been some science attempted to do around this. But if we are thinking about reality in this wider context, then these various phenomena that have been documented for all mankind's history, we could begin to perhaps think more scientifically about it and go, well, could this be a manifestation of X, Y, and Z? It gives us a whole new context to think about things that people, again, they do experience, but they quite often experience just individually. It might be very profoundly, but it's generally discounted as, you said before, just delusional. It's just it's just a dream.
Yeah, I will cautiously agree with what you just said. Cautiously, because when we say these words, paranormal phenomenon, aliens, other dimensions, angels and whatnot, these are very overloaded concepts. I don't know what people will think when one says these words.
It's like God, isn't it? You said earlier, you say God, and for some people they stop listening, other people pay a lot of attention. So I'm completely aware that all those little terms I use are just words, it's language, and they come with all this baggage.
Yes, there you go. So to make my answer simpler to give, I'll take one example. Let's take telepathy as an example, which is an example of a supposedly paranormal phenomenon. Personally, I think paranormal is an incoherent word. It's either true and therefore normal, or it's not true. There is no such a thing as true paranormal. I think we should throw away the word, but never mind. Telepathy. If you start from this idea that there is only an impersonal stream of consciousness and we are localizations in that stream, then what you have to explain is why everybody is not telepathic at all times. Because there's nothing to the whirlpool but the stream itself. Multiple whirlpools are all in the same stream. In other words, we are all part of the same mind at large, to use Aldous Huxley's expression. We are all part of one consciousness. How come we can't ordinarily read each other's thoughts? What we have to explain under idealism is the apparent difficulty in enabling telepathy, in realizing telepathy, not the fact that it exists, because that comes automatically. The way to explain why it's not more prevalent is this idea of attention, amplification, and obfuscation. I can't read your thoughts for the same reason that I was not aware of my breathing until before I just said these words. But of course, there are many degrees of obfuscation. Some are light, like my apparent unawareness of my breathing is a very light degree of obfuscation, and very deep degrees of obfuscation, like whatever else is going on beyond consensus reality and what's going on in the minds of other people. So yes, I would say that an idealist metaphysics would make room for certain phenomena like telepathy to be entirely natural. And what we have to explain is why it's not more prevalent. Under this idealist view, we should not be surprised at all that telepathy does happen sometimes, like Rupert Sheldrake's book, The Sense of Being Stared At, suggests that it does happen sometimes. That there should be no surprise about that.
Thinking about then the ideas, the aforementioned purpose and meaning, if we get past the purely materialistic view and we start to consider these ideas, there was one section in the book which I really liked, which I found spoke to me. I found it very meaningful, very thought-provoking, was the idea that this mind, this wider consciousness, could in fact be expanding its experience through our own experience, in fact through our limitation, because you're pointing out it's one thing that we seem to experience, whether we're materialistic or not. There's lots of materialistic people who just feel very limited in what they can do, even very spiritual people who feel a sense of frustration, but this might actually have a purpose. And there may well be other, I think your expression was ego-enabled entities in the wider consciousness having similar experiences for similar reasons, but it's also possible that we might actually be at the forefront of this, and that might sound terribly, sort of egocentric, but the way you wrote about it in the book, it felt like, I don't know, that you're considering something potentially very important.
This is again delicate, because I don't necessarily think, I don't think that we are in some kind of school, that there is a predetermined curriculum and teachers who have all the answers, and we come down to this earth to suffer and learn the answers the hard way, instead of the teacher just telling us what the bloody answer is. I don't think things are cruel and redundant in this way. I don't think this is what's going on at all. I don't think there is the purpose of having pain for the sake of having pain and suffering. I don't think consciousness is masochistic in this sense. I think what's going on is an experiment. I think because we are this one consciousness, we are poking around, we are probing in the dark, we are trying to get our bearings. And in the process of doing that, in raising our understanding, our self-reflective understanding of what's going on, which is what you get with localization. You not only lose awareness of everything that's going on outside the whirlpool becomes self-reflective, and that's the point of it. Through our self-reflectiveness, through the dance of life, including all its consequential sufferings, we are becoming more self-reflective about the nature of ourselves, about what's going on, about who or what we are and what's happening. I don't think there is a premeditation towards pain, suffering, and limitation. I think those are just part of this exploratory process. It so happens to be like that, if you get my drift here.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, I'd say you expressed it better than I did in my question. Well, all of this brings us, as we begin to wind things up for today, to that thorny old question of the ultimate origin of everything. Because you talk about, in your idea, in your central idea in the book, you make reference to our conventional ideas of the origins of the cosmos, the idea of the Big Bang. Behind that, the idea that mind has always been there, this wider consciousness, and that the void, but again, this is talked about in some other cosmologies, the void not being nothing, but in fact having potential. And I think you used the word involuntary spasm in this potential as perhaps the way that that this process got started. And of course, that's an idea I read before, talking about a ripple in this void of potential. And, in my mind, the question was still then, well, yeah, but who, why, when, where, how? Involuntary spasm, why, how, ripple, So
Yeah.
Again, I realize it's just the eternal return, but you don't shy away from speculating about that.
Well, I don't, because this doesn't make my position any more precarious than any other position, including materialism. You see, every worldview has to grant one free miracle. It has to grant one first cause that is not itself caused. You can't avoid that, otherwise you get into infinite regress. You have to explain one thing in terms of another, and then of another, and then of another forever. No, at some point you hit a wall, and there is that first cause. And in philosophy we call that the ontological primitive, which is the thing that you have to grant simply exists and was always there. You can't explain it, but you can explain everything else in terms of it. And the ability to do this, to explain everything else in terms of one ontological primitive, is the sign that you have chosen your ontological primitive well. Now, cut to materialistic science today. Their ontological primitives are various. In some corners, you have the hyperdimensional brains of M theory as the ontological primitive. We can't explain what the brains are, but we can explain everything else in terms of the brains. Or to more traditional high-energy physics, the basic building blocks of the Standard Model, a list of fundamental subatomic particles. Those are the ontological primitives. Now comes the test of whether your choice was good or not. Do you have the minimum number of ontological primitives, and can you explain everything else in terms of your choice? Under materialism, we don't have a minimum number, because we need basic laws of physics, we need fundamental particles, we need the brains, hyperdimensional brains of M theory. So you always end up with a small set, not one, always with a small set. And you can't explain the most obvious aspect of existence in terms of those ontological entities, those ontological primitives. You can't explain consciousness. And that's the hard problem of consciousness. What I'm proposing is another choice of ontological primitive. Let's choose consciousness itself, the most obvious in your face aspect of existence, as the ontological primitive. And then we can explain absolutely everything else in terms of consciousness. The price is that consciousness itself, like the building blocks of the Standard Model or the brains of M theory, consciousness itself isn't explained and isn't explainable. And in that sense, it is a kind of void. It is the one free miracle that we have to grant under any worldview. Under mine, consciousness is the free miracle. It so happens to be the most obvious, empirically undeniable aspect of reality instead of an abstraction of mathematical physicists. So there is something going for it. But it can't be explained. We have to simply accept that it exists. And by the way, maybe the whole of reality, the entire cosmic evolution at all levels, in all dimensions, in all realms, whatever there is out there, may be an attempt to answer this very unanswerable question. Can we figure out what the hell we are? I don't know whether we can.
Well, I've had this idea for a long time, and it's not uniquely mine by any means. And this has got nothing to do with any points you make in the book, that mind, consciousness, whatever you want to call it. Some people say God. We can use that term. We might as well have used it before. God is alone. So it has forged universes and everything in them as a way to forget itself.
maybe the terror of this realization of aloneness was the primordial ripple.
It's a possibility in my brain, so therefore. But in closing, Bernardo, if we then can accept or even imagine the sort of worldview that you're putting forward here, physical death then becomes a sort of a delocalization, a dispersion of awareness, from that whirlpool back out into a stream, however you want to use that metaphor, or others. And you also, I think you invoke the expression that somebody used with, life is a dream and dying is just waking up. And do you know what? Whether any of this holds any water or not, just to mix the metaphors, it can change how we live. Like I said earlier about people who are optimistic, people who are pessimistic. If we can consider this view that you're putting forward, it can have an enormous difference in the experience we have in terms of us living in fear, in terror of the dissolution of the ego and the loss of everything that we think of as I.
I think there is definitely prevailing fear of the ego to lose control, because the ego is a thought process that entertains the idea that it has some degree of control over itself and reality at large. And the dissolution of the whirlpool would imply the dissolution of the ego and maybe a fear of loss of control. We are never in control anyway. A whirlpool is never in control of the stream. It's an effect of the stream. But we entertain that illusion, and that can lead to some fear. But I think regarding the possibility of the end of consciousness upon physical death, I think different people react to it in different ways. I hear a lot this idea that we would feel better if we knew that consciousness wouldn't end. I can tell you my personal experience. I felt better when I was a materialist, because the notion that consciousness will end was a guarantee that all my problems, all my fears, all my regrets, all the bad things in life, it's a guarantee that those would definitely come to an inevitable end. And there was literally nothing to fear, because it's the end of consciousness. There is nothing to fear, literally. And that was very comforting to me. It allowed me to live my life in a rather cynical way, dismissing a number of values and ignoring the need for having an idea of meaning and purpose and so on and so forth. It was a carte blanche, a sort of an excuse to, well, I think you get my drift. Now that I would dare say I know consciousness doesn't end upon death. At least this is the reality I live. I am 99.99999% convinced as I can possibly be. I always have to grant something to doubt, because I'm still a skeptic rationalist, so I cannot say 100% as a matter of principle, but I'm as close to it as I can possibly get, as one can possibly get, to being convinced that death is not the end of consciousness. That, to me, means a degree of fear, because it means experiences don't end. They will continue in a form that I cannot even imagine right now. And that makes me feel rather like stepping on eggs. I feel a bit anxious about that now. That's my personal reaction to this.
Well, I've seen a lot of materialist people who would have felt rather like that until they came face to face with death, and a lot of religious people who were convinced of an afterlife and then were suddenly struck by doubt when they came face to face once again with death. So I think it can be something that we can rationalize, religious or materialist. And I'd like to think that I would meet death in a way that I could live with, but you know what I mean. But who amongst us can say until the time comes? And maybe we'll have time to contemplate it propped up in a hospital bed. Maybe we won't have any time to contemplate it. Maybe we'll just not wake up one day. Maybe we'll step under a bus. But if we have time to face death, some sort of certainty, who knows where our minds will go in terms of our thinking then.
I think the way we live our lives can definitely be changed based on this acknowledgement that death is not the end of consciousness. I think a lot of things would change in society, in culture, and in the way we live our lives individually. I think there are many practical implications of these differences in worldviews. And a non-materialist worldview would have many positive, I think, implications for society, even at very practical levels like healthcare, education, and so on.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And that's the one thing that I would take away from all this. Today, Bernardo, we've been talking about your book, Why Materialism Is Baloney. And we've only really been able to scratch the surface. There's just so much to think about there. And each little point we've touched upon, there's an entire section in the book devoted to it. So there's a lot to get your head round. So if people have been interested in any of what we've talked about, I'd urge them to pick up a copy of that. Before we sign off for today, tell folks about your website. I mean, your books are widely available everywhere, so that's not an issue. And also, you started your own podcast series, I believe, called the Inception Dialogues.
That's right. It's sort of frozen for now, but I intend to revive it. My last podcast was several months ago, but I intend to revive it. I also have a website/blog where I always publish essays there regularly, and people can see the latest in my thoughts on my blog, which is Bernardo Kastrup, one word, .com, Kastrup with a K. There's my YouTube channel, Bernardo Kastrup. If you search on YouTube on the channels, you'll find my channel there. I have dozens of videos and video essays and other types of videos in there. I have a Facebook page, Bernardo Kastrup, and on Twitter I am at Bernardo Kastrup as well. So I'm very easy to find everywhere.
Wonderful. Well, Bernardo, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy the show, please check out the website. That's legalizefreedom.com, legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including world affairs, politics and economics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, conspiracy, and alternative history. You can also browse and buy a range of books and DVDs from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.